Please be seated. When, I ask you, was the last time you changed your mind? By deciding, for instance, to let go of an ancient grudge or a tightly held opinion. By giving up a self-defeating behavior or walking toward a fear that has kept you paralyzed for years. Change is hard. So hard that mostly we cling to familiar patterns that were established ages ago. And mostly we are not even aware of those patterns. The problem, as Franciscan Richard Rohr so pointedly puts it, is that we are all conditioned, programmed, wounded, addicted, repetitive, habituated, and compulsive in our brain processes. He goes on to suggest that the actual content of those processes, what we think, in other words, doesn't matter nearly as much as our universal entrapment in those unconscious patterns. Your partner, for example, does that annoying thing she always does, and bingo, your irritation response kicks in automatically. Your least favorite talking head flashes on the screen, and your dismissive judgment tape starts rolling. You resolve to observe healthier eating habits, or exercise more, or watch TV less, or be more patient with the kids, or stop drinking, or finally have it out with your mother-in-law, or whatever. It doesn't even matter what it is. We all know what happens. Our resistance to change is almost always stronger than our desire to change. And yet, miraculously, some people actually do change. The prodigal, for example, comes to himself and returns to the Father who has loved him all along. One day, Paul is dragging Jesus' followers to prison, and the next, he hears the very voice of Jesus and becomes the most impassioned of disciples. Notorious slave trader John Newton gets so disgusted with what he has done that he becomes an Anglican priest and goes on to write over 200 hymns, including that most beloved and familiar hymn, Amazing Grace. Today's gospel lesson is, for many of us, a puzzler. By this time in Matthew's story, we are used to Jesus' skirmishes with religious leaders. But what are we to make of his reference to John the Baptist? And what, for heaven's sake, does the straightforward parable of the two sons have to do with anything? Let's start with a bit of a review. First of all, the entire sparring match between Jesus and the temple authorities, in this case the chief priest and the elders of the people, takes place on Monday of what Christians call Holy Week, the day after the so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It's Passover, and crowds of pilgrims are streaming into the city. Security is tight, and tensions are high. Now imagine this scene. First, Jesus stages a political demonstration by riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, creating a parody of Rome's might. The crowds, as you will remember from the Palm Sunday story, love it. Hosanna, they shout as they follow him into the city. Then Jesus heads directly to the temple, the heart of Jewish religious life. where he creates an uproar by driving out merchants, overturning tables, and calling the temple, the holiest of all holy places, a den of robbers. He has pulled off a dangerous 1-2 punch, managing to confront both the Roman Empire and the temple system, the two most powerful arbiters of the status quo, the arenas in which the power games of wealth and privilege get played out. We might expect Jesus to withdraw at this point, to lay low until things quiet down, but, and this is such an interesting detail to me, Jesus doesn't leave. Instead, and he's still inside the temple, he begins to heal the lame and the blind who come to him, endearing himself to the crowds, but enraging the authorities even more. Now, all of that happened on Sunday, according to Matthew. And now, finally, we arrive at today's lesson, the second half of chapter 21. Jesus had to have known that he was a persona non grata after what had transpired the day before. And yet, he shows up at the temple again for another round. Was he trying to pick a fight? Did he intend to provoke a showdown? We are not given to know what Jesus was thinking or feeling. And you can read the text for yourself and come to your own conclusions, but I am convinced that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. He was igniting the fire that would end within that very week in his death. This was the hour he had been moving toward all along. And so he returns to the temple and begins teaching. And the authorities are in no mood to put up with him. "Who do you think you are?" they demand. "Who gives you the right to do these things?" Jesus, who in this scene is not the meek and mild Jesus we are so comfortable with, Jesus does not back down, nor does he respond to their implied accusation. Instead, he counters with a question of his own. So they huddle, they confer, they argue, but the learned religious leaders cannot come up with the answer. Now, it's tempting, very tempting for us to pass judgment on them as clueless and pig-headed. But a better tack would be to ask, what is Jesus asking, not of them, but of us? The answer comes in the parable that follows. So obvious. It's the most obvious parable in all of the Gospels. It is so obvious that even Jesus' detractors get it right. The hero of the parable turns out to be not the dutiful, obedient son who fails to follow through, but the uncooperative, obstinate one who, drum roll here, changes his mind. The one who changes his mind. The text doesn't say why he changed his mind or how. Perhaps he came to himself like the prodigal, or heard the voice of Jesus like Paul, or took a fearless moral inventory as John Newton did. If you go back to the early chapters of Matthew and Mark, you will find that the very first words that Jesus utters at the beginning of his public ministry, his very first word is repent, which is easily the easily misconstrued English translation of the Greek word metanoia, which literally means to go beyond or change your mind. Tax collectors and prostitutes, homeless folk and prisoners, addicts and deadheads, perhaps because they have no illusions about their own righteousness, are often the ones more capable of change than those of us who think we have everything figured out and under control. To graduate from seminary, I had to complete a parish practicum. It was the most dreaded of all of the requirements before me because even though my vocational goals were rather vague, I knew for certain that I would never, ever, not in a million years, work for a church. Therefore, there was no point in even doing the practicum, much less preaching as a part of the practicum experience. I happily agreed to make hospital visits, attend meetings, teach classes, but preaching, forget it. The pastor tolerated my repeated refusals for the entire first semester, but finally she looked at me square in the eye and said, "Eyleen, the only way for you to know whether your aversion to preaching is a true expression of who you are, or evidence of the degree to which you have been silenced, is to try it and see how it feels." Her words were like an electric shock as I realized that no religious authority figure would ever have to tell me to be silent in church because I had silenced myself. And so, in fear and trembling, I said yes. I changed my mind, and that turn, small as it was, that metanoia, changed my life. My beloved friends, we are all, every last one of us, making our way to God. And I am here to tell you that the journey is not about getting the answers right or winning the argument or digging in your heels to make your point. It is not about being successful or having your name in lights or trying to prove in any way, shape, or form that you are worthy. It is not even about following the rules or minding your manners or being a nice person. Our stumbling walk toward God is about recognizing our fears and frailties, our failures, and the terrible vulnerability that comes with being human. And finally, somehow, learning to accept the amazing grace of being utterly, utterly lovable in spite of ourselves.